We are seeking submissions for Volume 4 of our Grassroots Anthology series. If you are a First Nations writer, poet, artist, photographer, please send us your work for consideration. You can email grassroots@mfnerc.com before February 12th.
You are now listening to Thunder Radio, the podcast of the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Centre.
Hi, and thanks for tuning in to Thunder Radio. I'm your host, Kim Kakigamic, and this is our November show. The idea of being a First Nations ally is something that I've been hearing and reading about recently, and Monique Woroniak is someone who came to mind when I thought about focusing a podcast on the topic. Monique is a non-Indigenous person who is very active in Winnipeg with trying to raise awareness and share knowledge with non-Indigenous people specifically about First Nations history and issues. She helped to create the website Groundwork for Change that covers all kinds of things like what does Indigenous sovereignty mean? What is cultural appropriation? What is racism? Is there anything I can do about these things? It was such a treat to have her in the studio, and I hope you enjoy our conversation about what it means to be an ally, or as she describes it, a learner of truth. I'm here with Monique Woroniak.
That's right.
So we'll start with if you could tell us a bit about yourself, such as where you grew up and where you went to school, and maybe how that led you to become interested in First Nations issues, if it did.
Sure.
Your background years.
So I was born in Winnipeg onto Treaty 1 territory and the traditional lands of the Red River Métis back in 1978. And I've lived here pretty much all my life. My family spent a couple of years in Germany when I was in preschool years. And I went away for one of my degrees to Halifax for a couple of years, but came back in 2007. I guess... like many non-Indigenous people that grew up in Winnipeg and of course elsewhere in Canada, I had what I'll charitably call it a weak education in terms of Indigenous issues, current issues, histories, the whole thing. And I didn't really have much of an awareness until I would say when I was about 11 or so. Can't do the math with the years, but I have a story that's out there and it's been shared in different forms about how I saw Elijah Harper on television around his killing of the Meech Lake Accord. And I was a kid that liked to stay up late and watch the news with my parents and watch the National with Peter Mansbridge and all those guys. And I remember seeing Mr. Harper on the television, and I was very confused because he was wearing a suit jacket. I can't remember if he was wearing a tie, probably was, but he was wearing a suit jacket, but he looked like and I'm making the air quotes here, he looked like an Indian to me, but he was wearing a suit jacket. So I was just totally confused because of course up until that point I think like most other elementary school children of that time in the 80s, I had not been given any information that Indigenous people were still alive. And in the neighborhood that I grew up in Fort Richmond in Winnipeg, you just you didn't see any. It turned out we had one Indigenous family living in our neighborhood, but I hadn't encountered them yet. And so when I saw Mr. Harper, I was genuinely confused. And I remember having to ask my dad, I'm like saying, who is that? And he said, that's Elijah Harper. And he explained a bit of what was going on. I was a precocious kid and tried to even at that time learn a bit about politics in the country. So he was explaining about the Constitution and how hard it is to change it and all the provinces have to agree and all this. And I said, well, he looks like an Indian. And I remember my dad correcting me and saying, we say Native peoples now at the time. And I said, but he's wearing a suit, right? And he said, yeah, that's because that's his job in the legislature. And I just remember sitting there going, oh, and I didn't ask anymore. I was also a kid. I thought, like many children, if they're fortunate enough, I looked up to my father a lot, and I thought he was brilliant, and I didn't want to look stupid in front of him, so I didn't ask any more questions. I thought I'll look into this on my own at some point. And so that sort of stayed there. And then probably my next real kind of encounter with any kind of Indigenous story or reality was in grade 10 or so at Fort Richmond Collegiate. We read April Raintree, as so many young people on the prairies do. And I loved that story. It was just great storytelling of Beatrice's. And I also loved that it named places that I knew. My father grew up in the North End, and my grandmother at the time still lived there. So I knew where the Louise Bridge was and many of the other places in the book. But I didn't know the history of children being removed from their families and everything that the book goes into. So that was sort of another thing going, okay, this is like another piece that's been missing. And then by the time I went to university, I did a political science degree and a bunch of women's studies courses, but most of my electives were filled up with Native studies. And it was just me, I think, trying to figure out, like the missing piece of the puzzle. I was always really interested in Canada, Canadian history, Canadian politics. I knew those were the things I was going to study. But I wanted the whole picture, and it became clear to me very quickly after I graduated from high school that I was missing huge pieces of the picture. And I'm just I guess inherently or genuinely curious person, and I also don't like not knowing things or not being told, and I think that's common to a lot of people. But and I just remember thinking, well, I'm not going to understand anything about this country unless I know this piece. So that's sort of what started my kind of more formal and more active education around trying to learn things. Yeah.
Okay. So I first came across you on Twitter, of course,
okay.
and sort of have been kind of following your social media, and so I kind of know you as being an ally of First Nations or Indigenous peoples, and so I was wondering, in your own words, if you could explain what that means, like if you would call yourself an ally and what that is.
I don't use that word myself.
Okay.
It's whenever somebody from various Indigenous communities may use it with respect to me. It's not something that happens all the time or something. But if they do, it's very, I consider that an honor, and I say thank you. So I say thank you to you. But I'm wary of it. I mean, language is a really hard thing, right? Because we need to use words to communicate in some way and call things something. But I think, first of all, I mean, no one self-declares themselves an ally, obviously, although you do hear it around there sometimes. I think the other thing is that it's a word that's becoming more and more common now, and it's almost like an identity that people take on or put on, I find sometimes. But that it stops at the naming of it, or the naming of themselves as that, or other people calling them that. And there may or may not be action being undertaken by people who are so-called allies, right? And I think that the best thing I ever heard about that word is that somebody said ally. That word should really be a verb, not a noun. Right?
And it should be action.
Yeah, it's like, because it's got to be action. And I think to the extent that maybe it's taken on a bit of a kind of an identity politics sort of slant to it, where maybe people use it. I'm not saying people in the Indigenous community, but people in the non-Indigenous community maybe use it a little too lightly sometimes, and maybe don't think about, well, what would that really mean, And there's all kinds of other words that are sort of bubbling up in terms of, what might be a more appropriate thing. But it's certainly the word that we one of the main words that we have, so I acknowledge that it gets used. I think that for myself, there's no short one word, but the phrase that I think of is usually, I just consider myself to be someone who's trying to learn truth, and that's it. So I don't know, learner of truth. It doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, right? But I think that really sums it up for me. I mean, there's so much truth that's being unearthed and uncovered and shared right now in this moment, especially in the country. And I think it's a responsibility of non-Indigenous people to be listening to that truth and learning from it. And it's a constant learning process. I mean, I think it'll go on until I'm no longer here on this earth. I can't imagine you could never know all there is to know, right? So I like that because it feels active. You're learning, you're constantly doing things. But then also hopefully I'm someone that tries as much as possible within my own personal capacities to act on whatever new truths I learn in ways that are appropriate and that take direction from individual community members or larger communities.
Okay. So I guess then how can someone who is non-Indigenous become, I'll use the term learner of truth then
Sure.
instead of ally.
Yeah.
I guess, so maybe just more specifics about what you were just saying. If someone wanted to learn more, what should they do? What should they do?
Oh, it's a great question. I mean, and like the answer to any question, it depends on the person,
Yeah,
right? Of course. That's the
course.
easy way out of that question. No. But I think, because say when we say non-Indigenous people, well, that's a huge range of people, right? That's people like myself, who are of European background, who came from, very sort of financially stable working class family. Like my parents weren't owners of businesses or high level managers or anything, but one was a teacher, one worked for Canada Post. We weren't worried about money. And I have a decent amount of education. One of my parents had quite a bit of education. And so there's my experience of being a non-Indigenous person. There are non-Indigenous people, both white and otherwise, who have grown up in relatively high amounts of poverty in this country. And then there's non-Indigenous people who are just very recent newcomers. And I say recent newcomers because I'm descended from immigrants. I'm new on this land and in many ways, certainly relative to the Indigenous population. But now, and of course in the news, we're talking about recent newcomers, right? Yeah. And all of our experiences are very much different, right? So I face maybe certain amounts of oppression because I'm a woman, so inherently you come across sexism and things. I face a little bit of some class oppression, right? Because I don't own a big corporation and not running things or something. But I don't face nearly as much as other members of the non-Indigenous community do, and I have a lot more opportunities. So I say all that because I think it's something to keep in mind. I think anybody, no matter where they are on the socioeconomic spectrum or what other challenges they may be experiencing in their life related to various types of oppression, whether it's sexism or ableism or whatever it is, can do something. But I acknowledge that I've been able to do, and it's easier for me to do more than it is for many non-Indigenous people. Having said that, I think, and again, depending on people's skills and abilities, for people that have access to the internet and have, the ability to read, right? You got to have those two things in order to learn a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of pretty good resources out there. You got to kind of weave your way through some not great stuff, but there's people out there that can point the way, and we've tried to do that with this Groundwork for Change website, which maybe we'll talk about after. Mm-hmm. And so there's that. And there's also, I think, especially here in Winnipeg, doing your best to keep an eye out and an ear out for where Indigenous people are gathering and what they're doing to speak out in public ways. Whether it's at a book launch, there's just so many now. It's like, it feels like it's one after another. It's wonderful. Or if it's at a demonstration at Portage and Main, or if it's, listening to music and a speaker and drumming at Thunderbird House, or there's ways of finding out about these things. It's easier now, I think, than it was, but you still have to be listening and watching, right? And I think there's no substitute for meeting people in person. A lot of people find their way into non-Indigenous folks, I think, find their way into awareness through whether it's books or reading things online or whatever it is. And I think that's great. I think it's necessary. But it's no substitute for being with people in the same space, right? And, listening to people's actual stories and just spending time with people. It's not necessarily like, okay, well, I'm in this space and what are people going to tell me about themselves? There may be situations where that happens just for the nature of the event, but just being with and meeting a whole range of Indigenous people, right? Because as varied as the non-Indigenous community is, that's how varied the Indigenous community is, right? You have people who are struggling and facing just unfathomable amounts of oppression, living on the street and facing high levels of violence, all the way to people like Justice Sinclair, right? Mm-hmm. And beyond, and business people and lawyers and teachers and people that work at McDonald's and people that are students, and right, their experiences of what it means to be Indigenous, I would imagine are quite varied, right? Mm-hmm. And their lives look different from each other. And I think it's important to meet and spend time with as many people from the community as possible, because it does remind you of I think people's individual humanities, but also it really works. It's the best medicine I can think of for breaking down stereotype, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. And we all know, I don't think we have to repeat them, but the general stereotype associated with the Indigenous folks. And but when you're meeting just such a range, right? Yeah. That you take for granted with any other group in this country, that range exists. But when you're meeting and seeing and speaking with that range of people from the community, there's nothing to replace that, Yeah.
That's so true. It reminds me of, one of my own frustrations is that so often everyone gets lumped into and Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Everyone just gets lumped into one group. And so I completely agree with you, and just that you have to meet individuals and hear stories and learn, like you said, learn as much as you can.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I really like that idea of learner. I mean, it's just because it's never ending, and it's about curiosity, but respectful curiosity, Indigenous people's stories aren't yours to own or hear, or, no one's obligated to tell you anything, right? But I like that idea of having a curious heart and then learning how to channel that in good ways.
Yeah. So you are working on Groundwork for Change, which is a website to raise awareness, to offer a place where people can learn. So maybe I'll have you talk a little bit about the website.
Sure. So groundworkforchange.org, and it's just all spelled out, is something that I work on in conjunction with a small group of white non-Indigenous settler women in Winnipeg here, and one lives in Gimli, and I will say their names because they deserve to have their names said. So Liz Carlson, Ashlyn Haglin, Lisa Stepnick, and Lark Gamey. And it's something that launched, I guess, at the end of June this year. It's something that I guess I did come up with and initiate, and then knew that that work it's never a responsible choice to do that kind of work in a vacuum. So put the call out to a sort of small community group of white settler folks here in this. They're generally, most of them are white settler folks here in the city, who are active in different ways, supporting and thinking about these issues, to see if anyone had some time to give some feedback and help build it and maintain it. It came about, I think, just after the idea for it, or the real push, was probably just after the Maclean's article about Winnipeg came out last year.
I was going to ask you about that
Yes.
later.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Maclean's article came out, and that was like all of this amazing truth, right? Coming right up to the surface in a very mainstream publication. I don't think there was anybody who's familiar with even slices of the true experience of many Indigenous peoples in the city that were surprised with what was in that article. And I know that there was a good cross-section of people from the community who agreed to participate in that article. And at least for the people I know, it was sort of a collective kind of exhale, or like, finally, kind of it's out in a really big way. It's not like people hadn't been telling these stories, but Maclean's is Maclean's. So, yeah. And after that happened, I got a call out of the blue from a radio station here in the city, and that hadn't happened to me before. And found my name, I imagine, on social media, and asked if I would do an interview about being an ally. I think that's what they said. And this is an aside, that a recording of that interview is still floating around online on some websites. And I was introduced as a self-proclaimed ally, and I almost died. I almost just fell through the seat. And it's not something I had said. I think the interviewer misspoke or something, or just... So if anyone finds it out there, I'm really happy. The rest of the interview was lovely. She asked good questions, and I think I represented okay. But that introduction was like, we got to clip that off. But after that happened, that interview, and it was on a morning show, and I got a relative flood of messages to my various social media accounts, and I would always get a bit of a trickle, depending on whether I'd set a post to public or not or something. And but I got a lot of messages, and they were all from people I didn't know. You look up on Facebook, someone contacts you, who do we have in common? And some of them I didn't have anybody in common, which I considered remarkable for Winnipeg. But and just asking like, I heard that, and I'm like, what can I do to help? Well, I'm not somebody that can necessarily answer that, but it was a lot of questions about, where can I find more about topic X, Y, Z? So I would send people links. I mean, like, here's the copy of Treaty 1, or here's, things I knew were reliable and I felt, were within my knowledge base to share. And, but it started getting to be a little too much, so hard to keep up with. And, but I was really excited. I thought, well, maybe this is the tipping point now. And it was something that had been rolling around in my head since the beginning of Aldo No More, going, I wish there can't just be one place, but I wish there was a place where a lot of the information was pulled together. And so after that happened, I was like, that's it, doing it. So I wrote up a little proposal for it and what it might look like. And I circulated it to about 12.5 members of the Indigenous community that I had some relationship with, and some that I had just sort of had only met once or twice, but I think they'd be interested in commenting on this kind of thing, and got great engagement and feedback back and some direction. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to go off and try to do this, and I'll be in touch in a few months probably. And brought those women in, and we really took the direction that we had heard in the feedback. And I should say, there was one person individually, Tasha Spillett. I'm
familiar with.
Yes, yeah. And I
yeah.
passed Tasha some tobacco, and we actually went out for supper. And because she works as an educator, she's close to my age. We have a number of things in common, and of course, a huge number of ways where we're very different. But there's many thoughtful people out there, but Tasha's just one that I happen to know a little bit better. And she really gave some good direction and grounding to go forward. And so we took what she said and what other people said, and kind of made up the goals of the site and the purpose and the audience, and everything on the site under the About section, if people look at it, are really what myself and those other women came up with. And then we just said, well, what are the categories that people are asking questions in? And we just listed them out, and I just started populating it and building it and filling it up. And it was the other thing that we thought we wanted to share information about, not just issue things like missing and murdered women, residential schools, etc., but also some sort of theory and concepts. So where can you find basic definitions of settler colonialism? Where can you find good definitions of different types of racism? Where can you find people talking about what it means to be a good ally or good supporter, and from an Indigenous or persons of color perspective, right? So there's a combination of information on that site and a community calendar as well. And so that launched at the end of June, and it's just had a wonderful response. Of course, it spikes at different times, right? But we've had, I haven't checked in about a week or so, but the last time I did, it was over 12,000 different people have been on that site since June, which is amazing to me. And so we're very committed to staying with it and growing it and trying to make it the go-to place, at least for Winnipeggers, because there is a fair bit of Winnipeg-specific information on it. Mm-hmm. And certainly the calendar, because we as I was saying before, you can do as much reading as you want, right? And it's great. And listening to videos, there's a lot of videos on there. But you need to meet people. And so it's really geared for non-Indigenous folks who have very, very little contact with the Indigenous community, or just starting kind of. And so we thought it's important at least to do our best to pull in as many events as we're hearing about around the city and get them in one place, so people, and a whole range of things. So there really is, book launches by academics, book launches by poets, concerts, the Aboriginal Film Festival, to when we hear about public vigils for women where the community has said, yes, it's fine to share this, to demonstrations and roadblocks. So, whatever, we don't have a limit on what's shared on there, as long as it's coming up from some segment of the Indigenous community, so that we feel that there's a real range of things for people to get engaged with, whatever their comfort level is, right? So yeah, it's been another interesting learning experience building it.
Yeah, well, it's a great site. I think it's very, very well done.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great information on it. So yeah, getting back to the Maclean's article that you mentioned, when Winnipeg was it called Canada's most racist city?
I believe I think that's the phrase they use, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a correct label?
I think that label sells papers. I don't know. I mean, I think Winnipeg, like many other cities across the country, has an enormous amount of racism in it. I don't know how you measure it. Yeah. I think Maclean's had, and I've forgotten now because I haven't read it since it came out, but they had a couple metrics that they shared. I think it was some surveys, not that they had done, but that maybe another think tank or somebody else had done. So they had tried to, we're not just pulling it out of thin air. But I think, I certainly think that it's no mistake that a city that has such a high Indigenous population can be said to have such a high level of racism. I don't think that's, and when we see, the levels of violence against Indigenous women and girls, and the levels of children being taken by CFS agencies, we see such huge levels of that kind of acting out of racial oppression happening, in cities like Winnipeg and Regina and Saskatoon, right? And it's no mistake, right? So I think, who knows about the most, but certainly there's an enormous amount. And I think it's both, certainly at a structural level, like when we talk about the racism that's built into systems, that's that they're just, I don't know what a good metaphor is, but it's a train. It's going, right? Yeah. It's built in. It's what keeps that train moving. Sometimes it's because somebody at a desk is making a deliberately racist decision to enact a policy. Other times it's because it's just the way the system is structured and has been for years, and it's just keeping going. And people are making choices not to stop it, right? So there's that structural racism that certainly exists at high levels in the city, but and I don't know because I'm not an Indigenous, but I just know from stories and from friends and colleagues that there seems to be a fairly high level of individual racism going on. Just, people calling people names or not getting service in a store or being followed in a store, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's a huge issue. I think it's a huge issue across the country, but and I care about what's going on across the country, certainly, but I think Winnipeggers, non-Indigenous Winnipeggers who reacted negatively to that story should have just said, don't worry about what everybody else thinks. Like, we have a problem here. Let's just worry about us. Who cares if we're more or less racist than Vancouver or whatever, But it was interesting to see the response by a lot of non-Indigenous Winnipeggers to how attached they were to some mythic reputation of Manitoba or Winnipeg. It was hard for me to relate to. I tried very hard. I wanted to understand that, but I never quite got there.
Yeah. So then I guess what can the average Winnipegger do to help in terms of, like, if they think we do have a problem with racism in this city, but I don't really know what to do about it because I'm just one person, and
yeah.
What would you suggest?
Well, it's a question I think through a lot, and I don't, I think what I have are very imperfect answers, but I think people need to be conscious that there are those, probably isn't just two, but those two types of racism, right? That's sort of those interactions on an individual level, person to person or small group to small group. And then there's that structural stuff, right? Now, for the individual stuff, I think it's not easy necessarily, but it's more straightforward. If people are seeing people being mistreated in a store, getting called a name on a street, all the examples that you can sort of think of, people need to say something about that. Or if if a colleague makes a joke in the lunchroom or whatever that's inappropriate, I don't care if there's no Indigenous person there to say it. Like, there's responsibilities to say things. Like, we know these things are not right and that they contribute to a really toxic culture that helps support all the structural racism that's going on. And so, there's non-Indigenous people have a responsibility to just say that, like, I find that language offensive. That language is offensive. And, please don't use it. Right. And so I think there's those sort of individual actions, right? When it comes to the structural stuff, it's less straightforward, right? I think non-Indigenous people, to the extent that they have the opportunity and like I said before, the level of privilege that non-Indigenous people experience, there's a range. But to the extent that they can, I think it's important that we learn about these systems that are in place. People should be aware that, at least it made it out onto the news that, at least in given time periods, there's one Indigenous child being taken away every day in this, right? It's astonishing, right? You should know about that and know about the histories that went on, that have led to that. The gift of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and their work and the survivors' bravery and their efforts to get their stories out. There's really very little excuse for people not to know about that history and the intergenerational impacts and how it's informed a lot of the things that are going on today. Even if folks can't read now, there's a huge number of videos online and other things. I mean, you still have to be able to access them and know where they are and get help with that. But it's becoming easier for a larger number of people. So I think it's important to understand a lot about how, as much as you can, about how the systems work and how the systems work against Indigenous people, whether it's the justice system, the education system, child welfare systems. And then to the extent that you can find out about what Indigenous people are doing to resist those systems and build their own systems, do what you can to support that. And it's like a really general answer, but as people hear about things in the news, or Winnipeg is a small place, right? And it becomes smaller and smaller the more people you meet. If you hear about people putting together a demonstration, or, putting together a panel to educate about what the actual experience is of CFS, I mean, the appropriate thing to do is, if it's open to the public, is to go and listen. And the next thing, whenever you feel comfortable to, is to ask people involved, is there something useful I can do, right? And never to rush in and take over or say, oh, I'm sure they'll need this. I know what they need. And, it's just to ask the question, is there something useful? How can I be of use here? Right? And sometimes it's, you can't. Just come and listen, tell more people what we're doing. And other times it's, can you bring this next time? And other times it'll be other things, right? But Indigenous people know what they need, and they have the solutions for themselves. And it's just a matter of asking if it's appropriate to be supporting them to push those solutions forward, or if we should just be listening in a given moment. But it's those two things. You got to call out that awful interpersonal stuff as you hear it. It's 2015. There's no excuse for that. But that structural stuff, it's harder. We have an obligation to learn about the histories, and then learn about the present day systems, and then support Indigenous people's solutions to them, right? It's tough.
Yeah. Do you face negative reactions to your, well, not necessarily to your work, but maybe to some of your work, to your point of view, or,
very little. And I try not to live in a bubble, but I probably do. And my circles of friendship and networks, and both personal and professional, tend to be with people that are more open-minded. And it doesn't mean that everybody is engaged in the way that I've chosen to be, but it certainly means that it's very few and far between the negative comment. I mean, any negativity that I've gotten would be just on an open platform like Twitter, the odd person, and I lump them into with apologies to any Winnipeg Sun or Winnipeg Free Press readers who are of open minds and good hearts. But I lump them into the same sort of things that you see from commenters on media sites, right?
Yeah.
And that you don't know these people, and it just, their opinion doesn't matter very much. I do get, I think what's more difficult to deal with, although it's not like horribly difficult, is people with, say, a good heart, a relatively open mind, but, I'm trying to think of an example, but might not quite, get or are looking to understand why an Indigenous group is acting out in a certain way on an issue. Okay. I think it came around a little bit, maybe around some of the round dances. Yeah, this is a relatable example. Some of the round dances that happen in Portage and Maine. I think in general, although this is hard to say, like people's reactions to those round dances were the non-Indigenous broad community were relatively positive, although you did see a lot of backlash, so maybe I shouldn't even say that. But they were such a joyful, open, welcoming, inviting space, right? But there were the times when Portage and Maine got blocked on New Year's Eve, right in the afternoon, right? And you'd hear the comments from what you would think are open-minded people saying, well, why do they have to inconvenience thing, right? Yeah, and these weren't even blockades, like, for Pete's sake, no one's stopping a train or something. But and it's sort of saying, like, whoa, and you get taken aback a little bit when you hear that from people that you might not expect it from. And it's, you just try to share information kindly first, right? And say, we're talking about half an hour here. These are people that have been displaced from their lands for generations, and Winnipeggers can be displaced from their root home for half an hour, right? And saying, and this is why, and you were invited to this, so listen for the next one, because everyone was invited to these things, right? And to experience it, and maybe you'll change your mind once you experience it. Because I think it's very easy, again, for people to say, oh, I think Indigenous people are wonderful, and I wish them well, and all, what's happening is terrible, and it's relatively easy to say those things. But then as soon as somebody becomes quote unquote inconvenienced or whatever, then you start to see, oh, okay, well, we have work to do with people's perspectives and what they know. And I think there's a really important place for non-Indigenous people to play, that have done some learning and can share some things. Doing all that correcting and that teaching, and that can't just be Indigenous people's work. They have their own work, that they need to do, that they want to do. And to the extent that a non-Indigenous person has been respectfully accumulating some truth around this and can figure out a way to communicate it, that's, I believe, our responsibility too.
Yeah. I really appreciate your answer to that, because I brought to mind someone I know who is dear to me, but who was like, they're just blocking traffic, and it's just,
yeah, well,
why are they doing that? Yeah, it's just like you said, it's just a half an hour inconvenience, but some people would get so upset.
Yeah. And I think that really, to me, and everybody's different, but I think you can't, after having learned some truth of the histories, you can't have that response. I don't know how it would be possible. I would love to somebody do a study on that, right? Teach all these people histories and then subject them to a blockade and see what they, but I just don't see how you can. And so to me, that my instinct, I get very impatient with it sometimes, and that's why I have to remember the kindness piece and think, okay, well, you're not ready to teach this with kindness just yet. So maybe say, let's talk about that tomorrow or another day or something. But I think the gift of those reactions, right? And this is some of the teaching I've had from community members, look for the gift that people are sharing something with you. What's the gift? So the gift underneath that statement is they're telling you, they're admitting, even though they're not admitting it on the surface, that they don't know all the histories, right? And so it's okay, well, that's a solvable thing.
Yeah.
That's actually a solvable thing, because here's the information, and here's the, it really just pinpoints it out, because I think it's true. I think you can't have reactions like that, and ones that are similar to it, if you know even a slice of the histories. I can't imagine somebody saying that. Yeah. Right? So I think that's sort of the gift of those statements. It's okay, well, somebody gave me a clear path to what the solution to this little piece of this is, but it's hard to hear. It's frustrating sometimes.
Yeah. Let's maybe talk a little bit about reconciliation, because that's been in the news, the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I guess if you can generalize an answer, it's probably a loaded question, but what do you think is needed for true reconciliation?
And this is something I've only spent more dedicated time thinking about, over the past several months. I think probably inherent in the learning that I've been doing over the past number of years, it's of course part and parcel of that. But to think of it explicitly in terms of reconciliation is certainly something if I had to be honest, I've only been doing it especially since the TRC report came out. Was following the commission and its work, and up to that point, of course, but again, framing things in terms of gifts is just such an enormous gift that the commissioners and the survivors and the intergenerational survivors have given to Canada. And the documents that have come out so far are astonishing, and what people are now able to find online through the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the U of M, the database that was just launched a couple of weeks ago, is just extraordinary. I think one of the reasons it's a difficult question to answer, because reconciliation probably means something different to every single Indigenous person in this country, I would imagine. People's experiences of settler colonial oppression and what their families went through, there are certain common things, certainly, the displacement from the land being the main one. But they all had, I would imagine anyway, people would have different experiences specifically of it, right? And the ways in which things were stripped from them, and the extent to which things were stripped from them, and how those things took place specifically. Everyone, chooses to, not that it's about forgiveness, but remove it from this situation, but when somebody has been harmed generally, I'm just abstracting it right out, right? People come to, everybody needs a different thing in order to have that harm repaired. It takes something different for each person, right? So I imagine that that's the case with Indigenous peoples across the country. I think in a general sense, what needs to happen is for the great mass of non-Indigenous Canadians to become aware of the histories, and not just of residential schools, but of all the things that are tied into that and supported that effort, and all the things that flowed from it. So people need to know the truth of how treaties were signed. People need to know about the land displacement. People need to know about the deliberate policies of starvation in the West. And people need to know about how these things link up to what's going on with CFS now, and what's going on with missing and murdered women. And I think that's another one of the great strengths of that commission, is that they did their very best, and I think they pulled it off, to connect all of these things and saying, yes, we're running this commission on the Indian residential school experience, but it is about all of these things, right? And there's some very practical direction. There's 94 recommendations in there. And some of them are geared to, say, levels of government and certain professions, and nurses and teachers, journalists are mentioned specifically. That maybe not all Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, fall into one of those categories, right? But you can take the spirit of what is said through all of that and say, what is at the root of that recommendation? And I think at the root of the vast majority, if not all of them, is people need to start learning the truth, and then acting on that truth and changing something. So there's one of the, I think it might be the last recommendation, or the second last, about changing the oath that new Canadians have to take, to include, I believe it's to include respect for treaties. But that's an enormous action, right? And it's both symbolic, but I think, if adopted, will have effects on people, the way people think when they first arrive in this country. So I think that there's some fairly big clues to be taken from the 94 recommendations. But I think, individual people tend to get overwhelmed about, how am I supposed to participate in reconciling a country's relationship with this population, right? And one of the ways I'm thinking about it right now in talking to people is saying, well, okay, if reconciling Canada is too big of a thing for you to, right, just what can you do to reconcile relationships with people in your community or your community's relationship with the Indigenous peoples that you're sharing the land with or that are sharing the land with you? And then that just comes back to good, truth learner action work, right? Yeah. That we talked about before. And that's, learn the histories, go meet people, ask what they want, right? And, those recommendations that the commissioners came up with, they didn't make them up themselves. They didn't go into a room and, okay, well, what should we recommend? Those bubbled up and are also grounded in and flowed from what they heard from survivors and intergenerational survivors. So that was even, an Indigenous body, that commission, those commissioners, asking the greater Indigenous community in Canada that was affected by these things, well, what do you want? What do you need? Like, that's a huge part, I think, of what that commission was about, saying, tell us your story, because there has to be a record of these things, right? But then what do you need? What do you need, right? And that same practice that's like one of the best sort of quote unquote ally practices, to say, what do you need? I don't know what you need because I'm not you. What do you need? Right? And then go about supporting them to get it, in the ways that they're requesting. And so I think reconciliation, because they're talking about reconciling Canada and Canadian society, like, right? So that means it happens it can happen in all aspects of Canadian society. It's not like just the job of the schools, just the job of the police forces, just the job of the justice community, of journalists, of the health care system. It's the job of all of those systems and all of the people, and even more than those systems, right? It's about everyone reaching out, learning histories, and saying, well, what do you need, right? And that's why that's why there's 94. I bet you they had more than that and had to pare it down. I'd love to find out. But that's why they cover such a huge range of things. I remember some of the mainstream commentary in the media was, some of the less kind commentary was like, this was a commission about residential schools. We got recommendations in here for journalists. We got recommendations in here for, like huge, like wide-ranging communities and sort of targets for recommendations. And these are people that just totally miss the point, right? It's like, because they did take a wide view of what these schools represented and what these schools caused. And you can't reconcile what happened in those schools by only implementing, say, new education curriculum, which is incredibly important, but it's just one piece of it, what happened in those schools and what happened before those schools and what happened after those schools affect Indigenous people's experience in this country in all aspects, right, of this country and its systems. So there needed to be recommendations for all of it. And so I guess that's sort of the good news for non-Indigenous people. It's like the whole thing is wounded or broken. So you can pick any piece of it and start going to work, and you're going to be working on it. You don't have to be a teacher, a nurse, or somebody who supports new immigrants, or you can just be you. But you need to be doing these things, because if you aren't, then you're part of that block that's not reconciling anything.
Okay. Well, I think we'll have to end there.
Sure.
Sadly. That's great. Yeah, unless there's anything else you wanted to add, or
I don't think so. I think and you can put this in, but the First Nations Education Resource Center should be complimented and applauded for its work. And it's one of those organizations that more non-Indigenous people should know about. There may not be anything that they can do to support necessarily or immediately, but just be aware that it's here and the work that it's doing. And in my professional life, I work as a librarian, and there are many, many books that are produced out of this facility that are for sale, and resources online that can be engaged with. And it's just one of those things that unless people make efforts or have been given the opportunity to know about, they might not know about. So I'd just like to thank you guys for your work.
Oh, well, thank you. And that's all for this edition of Thunder Radio. Thank you so much to Monique for joining us, and thank you for tuning in. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, and bye for now.